Matthew, thank you for coming on the show. I do appreciate it a lot. Before we get into it, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and your career ultimately?
Sure. I'm an engineer with over 20 years of experience. I've worked at Halliburton, Hess Corporation, Chesapeake, American Energy Partners, and then more recently working with the team, put a project together, raised private equity capital, drilled wells, operated the asset, and then sold. I'm also an author. I've written two books. For the past year or so, I've been focused on my second book, Shale Oil and Gas Operations, Maximize Cash Flow with Cost Reduction. Thank you for having me on your show, Joe. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah. So one thing that actually struck me quite a lot with yourself is so you basically started up your own exploration company, which is pretty cool. I mean, obviously I watched Landman, so it's a bit that's better. But what's that like? Yeah, doing that.
It's it was a lot of fun, a lot of work, a bunch of risk. So me and a couple other guys got together and we saw an opportunity um, to put an acreage position together. And on the first iteration, we put a package together and we sold it to a large publicly traded company. And then on the second iteration, we took that capital, went back out, found another position, put it together, and then raised private equity capital and drilled a bunch of wells, operated those wells, and then sold that to a private company. It was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun. So it was a very good experience, and a lot of interesting things came out of it.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt this show and I really hope you're enjoying it. One thing I'm going to ask you, if you're listening to it and you're not liking, following or subscribing to it, could I ask a massive favour that you do? It really helps the show, it helps me bring in more people and it helps me get more stories out there, which in favour brings more stories back in. Let's get back to it. And then your career prior to that, what was that like? Obviously Hess or, plenty of big companies in there as well. What was life like that like?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in petroleum and natural gas engineering, and then after college, I went to work for Halliburton in the Permian Basin in New Mexico and Texas. Um, Started on the cementing side, involved with a lot of drilling operations, then went over to the completion side. And then after a couple of years, I had an opportunity to go overseas on a rotation, 30 on, 30 off, and was in North Africa for 4 years. And after that, I went back to school for an MBA in New York City, and then went over to Hess Corporation on the corporate side as a financial analyst. So, and then from there, I went to Chesapeake and American Energy Partners, and I did a few other things. So I've seen the industry from both the services side and the operator side and the private side, big publicly traded companies, mid-sized companies, private equity companies. I've seen the full spectrum. So it's given me a lot of insight, which gave me the the knowledge and the confidence to write multiple books. I would not have been able to do that if I didn't see the full thing. Like especially my second book, which covers the entire operation from identifying a position, drilling, completions, production, the whole thing. And it's been a great experience. And a lot of colleagues, former classmates, and so on, they've only had the opportunity to see like one aspect of the business. Maybe they only saw the drilling side or the completion side, or they were always on the finance side or the management side, and those are great experiences as well. But if you're looking at the entire industry, the full spectrum, it's difficult to understand this business if you've only worked on one aspect, especially if you've only been on the operator side or only on the service company side, which, as you know, a lot of the work is going on the services side within this business.
So the books, the first one was Oilfield Survivor's Guide. What gave you the idea to start writing that?
Well, I love reading, and books are very valuable to me. I always wanted to write one, and throughout my career, I've seen a lot of good things, but also a lot of undesirable situations and mistakes. I mean, every operation that you're involved in, it never goes exactly as planned. There's always something that you have to adjust to, and if you know what to do, those are opportunities. But if you don't have that experience, it can be very expensive. So I wanted to put something out there was that no one else had done, that the industry needed, in terms of, like, let's look at over 1,000 experiences, undesirable situations, um, and put the learnings together from those, so that we don't repeat expensive, painful mistakes. And there were survival guides in a lot of other industries, but the oil industry didn't have one. So I thought it would be a good addition, and be something that people would value.
And then obviously you've just finished writing your second one, Shale. Where did that stem from?
Well, like, in our industry, we cannot control the price of the products that we sell. We don't control the oil price, the gas price, the NGL price, but what we can do is control the cost and the risk, and the capital allocation aspect of it. So it's something that's a huge part of our business, regardless of where you work within it, is controlling the cost. And it's also very difficult to do. I've been involved in a lot of cost reduction efforts on the services side and the operator side across my 20-year career. And again, there wasn't, it's something that I'm passionate about, and there wasn't a good book on it, on the practical application of how do you take, for example, a $10 million well and get it down to $5 million, or even lower. How to do that safely. And so I thought it would be a good addition to the industry to put this book together. And it's something I enjoy. Writing a book is a lot of work, and unless you enjoy the topic, it can be it won't be very fun. It can be painful. So whatever if you're thinking about writing a book, or one of the viewers is, you definitely pick a topic that you enjoy and that you're passionate about, because it's a lot easier to put the time and effort into putting it together. So, and that book took a solid year. It took me, it was actually over a year to write that book, working on a daily basis, like all day long into the evening, for about a year, to write shale oil and gas operations. So, hopefully the industry enjoys it.
One of the big things you do advocate for is the fact that you reducing costs, and being able to reduce them by 10 to 20%. Where did you get that from? Where did that stem from, so to speak, and why are you you're obviously quite an advocate for pushing that?
Well, if you're not pushing your costs down, they're going up. Their costs are almost always going up for one reason or another, and the majority of the people that are working on the wells are incentivized to push them up. So if you're not pushing back, you're going to have, slowly your projects, your wells, your company is going to be uneconomic. So somebody has to push back aggressively. Otherwise, your margin will be completely eroded, especially in, like, the shale end of this business, which is what most of the wells that we drill in the U.S. are focused on. So it's much different than, like, offshore exploration, which the cost, it's not as critical when you're on a big offshore exploration well from a cost perspective, compared to a shale horizontal, where the cost is much more critical when you're operating at scale. So you always have to be pushing on the cost, and you want 10 to 20% is fairly straightforward, and you can almost always reduce your cost 10 to 20%. But some of the stuff I talk about in the book is things that you can do to reduce your cost 50, 60%. Like, if very big, serious cost reduction efforts. The 10 to 20%, that is usually fairly straightforward, and you can achieve that at any point in time, just because your costs are always going up and there's always an opportunity to reduce them, whether you're looking at the invoicing, the structure, the bidding, benchmarking, or optimizing procedures. Any one of those 5 things can give you 10 to 20%. If you do them all, you should easily get 20% cost reduction.
What are some of the small operational decisions that look harmless at the time but become very expensive later on?
Well, it's a good question. If anything that impacts production performance or safety might initially look harmless at the time, but will have a long-term impact. For example, if on the drilling side you decide to eliminate mud logging, let's say, because you think it's an unnecessary expense, even though it's like a small expense, that could have a huge impact on your long-term production if you drill the well out of zone. If you're looking to cut your ROP and you drill in faster rock, but it's not as productive, initially you're going to feel good that you reduce your costs, but over the long term that this well is online, you're going to have a production performance impact that you're going to have to live with on a daily basis. And it goes the same thing is for safety. Like the foundation of cost reduction is you want to have great people and great risk management. If you sacrifice either of those, particularly on the risk management side, in terms of an impact, it's never worth it. Like sooner or later you're gonna get penalized, and that cost is gonna erase anything that you ever saved. All right, if you're doing something that has a high amount of risk, just statistically, you're going to get in trouble sooner or later when you're operating at scale.
Well, one of the things actually that well, I guess we first started speaking about was Deepwater Horizon and your views and your research, and you spent quite a lot of time, should we say, quite an extensive amount of time looking into it. And you came across quite a few things. Do you want to kind of take us back? Because obviously I remember when we first spoke about it, I was still a bit shell shocked. But do you want to kind of take us to your views and when your kind of fact finding that you came across with doing your research into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I first started looking at what happened when the accident occurred and all the information initially came out. I did a ton of research. I put a lot of that in my first book, but I've kept up with it over the years. And I've when all the trials came out on the civil side, I've followed along, and more recently when a lot of information came out on the testimony from Don Vadrine and some of the stuff that Bob Kaluza put out, I followed along because I wanted to understand the accident. To me, it was very surprising that what was considered the number one deep water rig in the world with some of the best people on it running the show, and you have an accident like this. I became somewhat interested as to like how this could have happened, right? And I think after looking at like all the data over many years and taking the time to think about it and process everything, that I know exactly why this occurred, and it's I haven't seen anybody on any podcast or any report fully explain exactly why this occurred. I watched the shows on the podcast on your show, which I thought were excellent with Leo Lindler and John Guide. So Leo's been on a lot of he's done a bunch of media, and he has a lot of strong opinions, and it was great to see John Guide come out and give his opinions as well. I also have my own opinions on exactly why this occurred, and in my opinion, based on my research and all the data, I don't think that it at its core had anything to do with the cement, the centralizers, the bond log, whether or not they ran a packer. I know, Leo feels strongly that if they would have run an RTTS packer or some type of mechanical isolation as another barrier, that this accident wouldn't have occurred. And of course, another barrier can add value, and many people do that in certain situations. But to know for sure that that would have prevented the accident is impossible. And I don't think that at its core, not running a packer was the reason why this accident occurred. Like I've recently, not long ago, had a situation where we ran a packer as an isolation and it failed during the negative pressure test, and we were able to identify that. What most people don't know is that 4 months before Deepwater Horizon, another rig in the North Sea, where in the area where you work, SEDCO 711, working for Shell, had a very similar accident to what occurred on Deepwater Horizon, and they had subsurface mechanical isolation, and they almost had a similar situation as Deepwater Horizon, but they were able to isolate the blowout. But they did have a blowout; it just didn't catch fire. And most people don't know that, and that was only 4 months before Deepwater Horizon. Right, in my situation, we had we just completed the frac operation, so there was a lot of pressure on the well. We ran a isolation packer in order to run tubing into the well, and everything looked great. We shut the well in, and I was on location for this whole situation, so I saw it firsthand, and I was troubleshooting along with my team. We thought everything went well, and we were processing invoices when one of my guys came in and said, "Hey, there's pressure on the well," which if I just ran a packer to isolate pressure, I shouldn't see any pressure. And we had about 1,000 pounds on it. So immediately we went out there, we looked at the gauge, and my first thought is the gauge is, maybe the gauge is broken. But let's see. We open it up, we bleed it off, it goes to 0. And you don't really see much flow at that point, right? It was like trickle flow, insignificant. It's not going to catch your attention. We shut it in, pressure builds back up to about 1,000 pounds. Okay. So we then watch it 5, 10, 15 minutes, open it back up to see if it'll bleed off. It bleeds right off. Trickle flow, barely any flow. It goes to a stop, then you see a little trickle. We shut it back in. I go over to the production facility and pull another gauge because I want to make sure that the gauge is not busted. Install another analog gauge. It builds back up pressure. So at that point, I got 2 gauges. I know that pressure is real, but I don't see any flow, right? We open it back up after, watching it for another hour or so. It bleeds right off. You see, a little bit more flow this time, but nothing significant to catch your attention. This, again, everything I'm describing to you right now is very similar to what they saw on Deepwater Horizon, right? So what I'm looking at is a failed negative pressure test. I don't see a lot of flow, barely any. It's just like a trickle, but it builds pressure. Now, why is something like that happening? Because you're probably seeing, well, in our case, the beginnings of the packer failing, right, to contain pressure. So it's like when these situations happen, it's like you're having a subsurface choke, right?
Mm.
So you're not going to see massive flow, and this, and I've done plenty of negative pressure tests, and most of the time they're fine. You don't see any pressure, you don't see any flow. But if you do enough of them, you're going to see them fail.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I did not know until I went through the transcripts for the civil case when Don Vadrine testified against Bob Kaluza. These are the company men on the rig, right? So Don Vadrine was played by John Malkovich in the movie, and then you had the other gentleman playing Kaluza in the Deepwater Horizon movie. But in the trial, the Department of Justice asked Don Vadrine, how many times have you ever seen a failed negative pressure test? And he said never. So this guy was incredibly experienced, okay? One of the most respected individuals that do this. And in his experience of almost, I think, 30 or 40 years, he never, for whatever reason, saw a failed one. And that's great that he never had to deal with a failed one. But now you're going to see it for the first time on a exploration well, in a serious situation. And I would assume that Kaluza, the same type of situation, and maybe it was the same for the majority of the guys that were analyzing what was going on. And I think this is at the core of the accident because, when I look at Kaluza's book, and he put a book out on the situation, kind of defending his position, because I don't think he ever testified. At least I never saw any testimony from him. The only stuff we saw was from Vidrine against Kaluza. So they ended up, essentially Vidrine was testifying against Kaluza in the DOJ trial for the criminal case. So I was very, very curious to see what those two said about this because I wanted to learn exactly how could this have occurred, right? And one of the critical things to understanding why this accident occurred is I found in Kaluza's book, because I want to make sure I read this correctly because it's very important. Is that he says in his book, if there was any communication with Macondo reservoir pressures leaking into the well, there would have been immediate, massive, and continuous flow out the open drill pipe. That's absolutely not true. Okay. He's saying that if during the negative test, that if the barriers failed, he would have seen massive, immediate, continuous flow. But that's not true. It can be true, but very often when your barriers are failing in the initial minutes, you will not see a huge amount of flow because the barrier is just starting to fail. Right? If it's coming up, think about it, you're going up through, let's say, bad cement, through cuttings, up through float equipment potentially that has either collapsed or failed. So there's all kinds of components that the oil and gas has to flow through to get out and then come up to the surface and put pressure, right? So and that's all being choked. Like in the recent case that I dealt with, you had to get around a packer that we believe was not fully set. So like in my situation, you would see pressure build up, I bleed it off, shut it in, pressure comes back up. And we did that for probably an hour or two. And I didn't want to let it flow too much because my concern at that point was if the flow starts to erode what is the packer is holding, it's going to shoot that packer up out of the well like you're firing a bullet out of a gun and potentially blast through the wellhead. And now I have a full out well control situation. So I was being with my team very ginger with it. Because I wanted to make sure that we actually did have a failed negative pressure test. Because when you're first seeing this, in my experience, you don't want to believe it. You're thinking really, I'm at the 1 yard line, I'm almost done with this well. And now you're going to do like this to me. That's what I was thinking in my mind, because that well that I was dealing with, it was a difficult well to drill. It was an easy well to complete, but now I'm about to bring it online for production, and I have a failed negative pressure test. So your first inclination is this really happening? And I assume probably on Macondo they were kind of thinking the same thing. You're on the front lines. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback this after the fact, right? But when it's you on location and you're the one that's analyzing it, it's very different and it's very difficult. And these failed negative pressure tests, they're incredibly deceptive. One of the words that we use is it's squirrely, it's tricky, it doesn't quite make sense. If you're trying to figure out why is it building pressure but it barely flows, and that's probably because it's being choked. And these things can fail 100 different ways. In my case, I was thinking, okay, it could be the packer, it could be my casing, maybe I have a cross-threaded connection. All these things are going through my mind. I was hoping it's just the packer. What if it's my casing? What if it's something else? This could be a multi-million-dollar, problem. and when it's your own money and your partner's money and your investor's money, the pressure is really on. So I was sweating, because this should not be happening. I'm supposed to be running tubing tomorrow, and I'm supposed to get this well on by Friday, right? And my investors want to see production. We need to start, making money off of this well. And I'm dealing with a failed negative pressure test. So there's always some type of pressure on you. And I'm sure, the guys in Macondo, they felt the same type of pressure, but they probably, and according to the testimony, did not have the experience ever dealing with a failed negative pressure test, and they didn't know exactly what it looks like because, and also according to Kaluza's book, you could see he's saying because he didn't see immediate massive continuous flow, that this pressure couldn't have been from the reservoir, right? He's mentioning that multiple times in his book, right? I'm going to try to find another one. Like he says again, like if the 1,400 pounds had been created by communication with the Macondo formation, as theorized by the blind investigation team, when the drill pipe was opened at 8 p.m., flow out of the pipe would have been immediate, massive, and continuous. Flow would have never stopped! Exclamation point. In fact, flow out of the drill pipe would have looked very similar to the oil and gas flow that continued for 87 days from the out-of-control Macondo well. That's absolutely not true. It doesn't happen that way, because when you're doing the negative pressure test and you're seeing those barriers initially fail, when you remove the mud and you put it into an underbalanced situation, it's not going to, in many cases, instantly collapse. It often happens very, very slow in the beginning, and that's why it's so deceptive. That's why on a lot of land wells, when these type of situations happen, they get as far as removing the entire BOPs off of the well, and then it blows out. And you have to wonder, like, how does that happen? Like, if you look at my first book, I have a table of I don't know, it's like maybe over 100 like well control events, and you can see a number of them. Like I classify them like what happens, and a number of them, if you look at the description in Oilfield Survival Guide, it says like cement job completed, BOP removed, well blows out, and that's a situation where there's no BOP even on the well. It's just stick up casing. So you're completely out of control. You have no way to isolate it, right? So how does something like that happen? It happens because people misinterpret the negative pressure test. Or, just like Macondo, if you have a successful cement job, unfortunately in our business, if you have full returns, if you bump the plug on time, and everything looks great, the default response is there's no more risk. Let's move to the next well. And that is a mentality that needs to change. And by discussing it on your podcast, and I hope this gets out there, people start to understand why that you don't want to do that, right? You never want to turn your back on a live well, because it could flow at any time. That's why, like, when people on Macondo, they blame the cement, they blame the centralizers, they blame the bond log, or the bladder effect explanation, or the negative pressure test. All that stuff's important, of course, but at its core, it's not why this accident occurred, in my opinion. It occurred because when they underbalanced the well, when they removed the primary flow barrier, nobody was watching to see whether or not the well can flow. Like, they did everything, and they said the test was good, and that's fine, right? Like, okay, so they made a mistake and misinterpreted the negative pressure test. Then, after that point, they said everything's good. Then they removed the mud. So now, for the first time, this well is fully underbalanced. If there's any differential pressure or any dynamics that are unfavorable, you could have the casing fail, you could have a connection fail, you could have the floats fail. Anything's possible at that point, which is why we monitor the well for flow. But that wasn't done. They removed the mud, and nobody was watching to see whether or not this well could flow. And there was at least a 30-minute or more period of time where it would have been very evident that the well was flowing. And 30 minutes in our business is a lifetime. You should be thinking in seconds. Like our industry, when you're trying to address problems like this, I'm operating from a time frame of seconds, from a framework of I want to react fast enough to catch it. So 30 minutes is a very long time. So even though let's say you had bad cement or you didn't run the bond log and um, you misinterpreted the negative pressure test because they said it was from the bladder effect, right? The pressure differential across an annular, all that, right? That's fine. But now you go and this is the problem that I had. Then you go and you remove the mud, and now we're going to learn the truth as to whether or not everything is static. And nobody was deeply engaged to see whether or not this well would flow. And that's also why onshore you have these well control events where they go as far as removing the entire BOPs. And you're thinking to yourself, like, how could they remove the BOPs on a flowing well? And the reason is, like, onshore we displace with fresh water because it's more efficient. We're not, so that you don't have to, you're automatically after the cement job in an underbalanced situation because you have fresh water inside of the casing. And if the cement job goes well, the default is everyone is celebrating. Just like what happened on Macondo. If you followed that accident carefully, and that it's like after the cement job, everything looked great. They had full returns, bumped the plug on time. Everyone's celebrating. The engineers get on the helicopter, they leave, and people kind of like check out at that point, right? There was a lot of, they went to bed or whatever the case is. But for me, like, if my experience is, if somebody said you could watch the cement job or all the steps afterwards, I choose the steps afterwards because they're much more intricate and tricky and deceptive, and there's a lot less telemetry and oversight on everything that's occurring after the cement job. The cement job already has so many people focused on it and so much tech on it that going out to see it is good. You want to make sure everything goes okay, but the steps afterwards are far more tricky and difficult and have a lot less oversight. So that's just, that's something that you learn over time, right? So, and again, like in this situation and many others that are like it, which is why I don't think the industry has fully learned from Macondo. And I can go into that as well in some of the conversations that I've had with senior level executives. I don't think that we have done a very good job explaining this particular accident, which cost over $60 billion and destroyed a lot of people's lives, and to this day has an impact. You know what I mean? So, it's there's so many factors that were overlooked. A lot of stuff that's out there was designed to put the full blame on BP to make sure that they are seen as guilty, right? Which and that does not do our industry a service in terms of preventing this from occurring in the future.
Why do you think we've not learned then?
Well, never turn your back on the well. When that's the first thing. And when you underbalance the well, when you remove the primary flow barrier, you have to check to make sure that the well is not flowing, because it can fail. Any barrier can and will fail. That's why, like, when Leo said that he thinks the solution is to always run a packer, right, on your podcast, and he was deeply involved in this accident. He's been through a lot of trials. He's done a lot of media, and he's saying that the solution is to run a packer. And I think that is an option. It's another barrier, but that still doesn't address what happened, because a packers can fail, right? I had one fail not long ago. The SEDCO 711 rig had one fail, and it almost burned to the ground. So even if you run a packer and you're doing, let's say, hundreds or thousands of these over the course of your career, sooner or later, you're going to see the packer fail. And if you're not paying attention at that point, you're going to have a well control event, maybe similar to what happened with Macondo, right? So another barrier is great, but it's not the lesson from Macondo. Once you put yourself in a situation where when the well could flow, you need to make sure that your barriers are holding, and you need to analyze the negative pressure test correctly. So, like, one of the mistakes that was made on Macondo was they saw the pressure And when they went to open it, it didn't flow, right? Like very little flow, if any, is what some of the notes say. It was trickle flow, but that's common because you're seeing the initial amount. You're seeing the initial failure. Remember, you're flowing past a failed barrier, which is acting like a subsurface choke in many cases, and that was the mistake that they made. So like, if one of us was on the rig and this was happening and they open it up and it barely flows, and somebody would have said like, hey, no, this is what you see when you fail because the flow is being choked. For example, if I have a well that has 5,000 pounds on it and both of us are standing at the surface, I got a brand new well, a powerful well. I got 5,000 pounds at the wellhead and I have a wheel choke. I could crack that choke open, just a crack, into a separator, and I can make it flow just like a trickle, like barely noticeable. You will see barely any flow. I got 5,000 pounds at the wellhead. We're on a wheel choke. I just crack it just a little bit, and you will see a trickle flow. And if I'm flowing into a separator, we will build pressure, right? But with barely any flow over time. You're going to see the pressure slowly come up, come up, come up, come up. And then when you open it, you'll see like very little fluid. Shut it in again, and here comes the pressure again, because I'm flowing through a choke. In the failed barrier situation, that choke is in the subsurface. It could be, a channel in the cement. It could be a cross-threaded casing connection. We've all seen those. It could be failed floats, or a combination of everything. The reason why you're not going to see massive flow initially is because you haven't perforated or stimulated this well. It wasn't prepared to flow. So you're seeing this little bit of flow that you're seeing is the beginnings of the barriers failing and acting like a choke. The more you flow through them, the more they get eroded. That's probably why, like in the beginning, they saw the pressure coming up, they opened it, bled off. It comes up and bled off. That's what I've seen, throughout my career. But if you let it continue, it's going to erode that flow path more and more and more until it becomes a roaring well, if that well has the power to flow, right? So like, and if when they displaced all the mud, that well is flowing, and the more it flows, the more it will flow, because it's eroding everything. It's like, one of the ways that I've explained it is that we've seen a lot of protests recently in the news, right? There's all these protesters all over the world. Imagine you have a bunch of barriers, and there's a bunch of protesters, and they rush the cement barrier, they break through it, they get to the fence, and they're shaking the fence. So the pressure's there, and maybe one guy gets a hand over, and like one person gets over the fence. So you have thousands of people pushing on that fence, and maybe one gets over. So in the beginning, you barely see anybody, but they're all there. But eventually, if you're not paying attention, they're going to knock the whole fence down and come across. So initially, when you see that little bit of flow on a negative pressure test, you really want to pay a lot of attention, because those are the first initial signs that the barriers are failing. Where it gets tricky is very often when you bump the plug on a cement job, or you do a displacement, is that there's some residual flow. You almost always see some little bit of residual flow until the well stabilizes, if it's going to stabilize. And that's why on shore you see people, like, they'll bump the plug, they think everything's great in the cement job, and they'll see this residual flow. They don't see a massive flow, just a little bit, and they pull the BOPs off, and then here it comes, boom. Like, it just all of a sudden blows up in your face. And you have to be a little bit neurotic, okay? When I'm doing it, before I'm going to pull BOPs off, I like to be, if I'm on location, if I'm there for it, I like to be standing right there, and I'm looking at the flow, like I'm zeroed in, and I want to see like everything. Like, I want to see it. I'm comfortable when it's static, when there's nothing. I don't want to see anything dripping across. I don't want to see any movement in that flow. I want it to be completely static before I pull those BOPs. You have to be a little bit paranoid before you're gonna do this. You don't ever want to turn your back on the well, because it's gonna get you. It's gonna make you pay, right? The one time you're not watching is when you're gonna pay the price. So, those are the learnings, right? So just knowing that when these things fail, you don't see a massive, continuous, immediate flow. You'll see pressure when it's failing. The pressure will build up, and you go to open it, and you don't see the flow. And in my opinion, that is the mistake. When you put all the pieces together, from the transcripts, from the investigations, from Don Vadrin's testimony, from Kaluza's book, and you say, okay, like, what happened, right? Because, like, John Guide, I thought that was an excellent podcast that you did with him. He says in his podcast that there were two things that he doesn't know, like why the cement failed, and then why they misinterpreted the test. And why the cement failed is anyone's guess. It could have been contaminated, who knows? But why they misinterpreted the test, I'm explaining to you the reason why, right? Like, we just went through it, and I don't think it's done. Nobody has explained this. It's not anywhere on the internet. It's not in any podcast. Like, I think this, we're doing it right now for, one of the first times, explaining like how that mistake happened, and so it was just, I know you asked previously, was this a technical mistake, a cultural mistake? This was a mistake because they did not have enough experience seeing these things fail, and they didn't understand what they were doing with. I don't think it had anything to do with like the procedures or the culture or any of that. It was just they hadn't seen one of these things fail like this, and so they were confused when they saw the pressure, but it wouldn't flow, right? And you can tell from Kaluza's book. He's saying it in the book. He's saying that he's defending what he did, and he's saying that if this was from the reservoir, we would have seen, continuous massive flow, and that has not been my experience. That is not what I've seen, and that is not correct. Okay, that's the mistake. And I'm surprised that after like $60+ billion and all these experts that they had, they never found it. They never got to that, because I don't see it anywhere.
Why do you think the situation that happened 4 months earlier on, was it SEDCO 72? You said, why did you say
SEDCO 711 in the North Sea, the Transocean rig. You look it up. That's on the internet.
Why was that never taken into like, obviously, if they had a similar situation, why do you think that never got probably passed around better than it should have?
I think that was a very big mistake. And and again, that's one of the reasons why I wrote, why I write books, why I wrote my first book, is to share information to prevent stuff like that happening. If you're looking, in my opinion, I know from your, the podcast that you've done, Leo has strong opinions on who is responsible. And, I think he blames a lot on the people in the office. I disagree. Okay. And I definitely don't think John Guy was responsible for this. I think he did an amazing job on the podcast, and looking at it as someone that's been in this industry for over 20 years, and I spent a ton of experience, a lot of time on the similar situations. And, again, I told you why I think this occurred, and I don't think he's responsible at all. So I think you should let it go. He's not responsible for this accident. Okay. One of the things that angers me is that a similar situation occurred, and that information was never shared with the team. I've spent a considerable amount of time throughout my career making sure that the guys that I'm working with know every possible thing to be successful. And I spend a ton of time on the front lines to make sure that they're aware of anything that's happening around us, offset operations, non-ops that are having similar problems. And here you have a situation where another rig, just 4 months before, on December 23rd, right before Christmas, which accidents often happen before the holidays too. That's a whole nother topic. But 4 months before Macondo, they had it's, in my opinion, based on the data that I've found, it looks almost identical to what occurred on Deepwater Horizon. And they had mechanical isolation, like what Leo wanted, right? They had something very similar in the well, and it failed. And they almost burned down the rig in the North Sea. And that information was never shared. And according to reports, and I'm not sure whether or not this is true, but it's in reports online. You can go look it up. The manager executive over that area claims that when that information was given to him through an email, he was on vacation, so he didn't have a chance to share it. That's unacceptable if that's true. Okay, so in my opinion, for like, what would I have done in this situation? It's easy to Monday morning quarterback, but I'm telling you what I have done, what I do, and what I plan to do in the future, and what I've done throughout my entire career is when something that serious occurs, I take it upon myself to go out to the field and personally talk to every single person, about what happened. Go through the situation, give a presentation, and do whatever is necessary to make sure that everybody is aware. And I think that if that was done, you never would have had the Macondo accident. We would have never been talking about it because they would have educated their entire company on the risk after, you do a cement job and think everything is secure, right? That's a big problem within our industry, is that if the cement job goes well, people turn their back on the situation and don't monitor for pressure. And they go about like displacing the mud, transferring the mud, getting ready to move to the next location. You're not focused on the risk, right? You have a live well now. So like if it's going to come on, it's going to do it right now. Like you just remove the mud and you can't ignore the potential that this well is going to flow. Even if you have 10 packers in the well, maybe the casing is ovalized, right? If you have ovalized casing or some deformed casing, you could run as many packers as you want in the well. It's going to flow past them, it's going to erode them, and it's going to start shooting them out like bullets out of a gun. Anything can happen in this business, and it often happens at the worst possible time. Not sharing information, and they did not share that information with their own employees in the Gulf, the customer, like, BP. They didn't share it with them. They didn't share it with anybody. And then you have a similar situation, and now I'm going to blame all the guys on location. I'm going to put Don Vadrine and Kaluza. I'm going to blame them. That's ridiculous, okay? You can't do that. You have to take some responsibility. You had a similar situation on another rig. You didn't share that information, and then another rig did it, and all these people were killed, and it cost $60 billion, and now I'm going to blame the customer now. Like, shame on you. That angers me, okay? That's why I write these books and share this information, because I don't want that to happen. I don't want people to repeat these expensive, painful mistakes when they don't have to. Like now if somebody's sharing this information and you now know, like, we shouldn't be doing that, and then you repeat it, well, then that's on you. Like, you didn't, you want to learn the hard way, which is very expensive, right? So, but in this case, from the research that I've done, that information was not shared. And I believe that when this accident happened on Macondo, they had a bunch of executives that were there giving a safety award, right? The movie shows that, and that actually was true. And they didn't even know that they had a similar situation on another rig, right? So that wasn't shared. So like one of the things that I do, and I encourage others to do this as well, is in management positions, executive positions, engineering positions, is study everything that's happening around you. Gather as much information around you and consolidate that and put it in a form that's easy to digest by the field so that they can learn. It's my opinion that we have a responsibility to give our team executing on the front lines every possible tool to be successful. And you never know, like, what somebody does or doesn't know. One of the things that I found surprising when I was reading through the transcripts of the later cases on the Macondo situation was that Don Vadrine and others who had almost 40 plus years of experience, these are some of the most experienced people on the planet doing this. They never saw a failed negative pressure test. So I no longer assume that a guy that's been doing this for 50 years knows everything, because there's always going to be something that he hasn't seen. And there could be a guy that has 1 year of experience that knows more than the guy that has 50. And that's possible because that guy with 1 year, he saw 5 failed negative pressure tests. So he knows what it looks like. Whereas the guy that had 50, for whatever reason, just luck, or unlucky, he never saw it. He never saw that happen, and usually what I've seen, like after undesirable situations, it's not uncommon for people that have tons of experience to say, I never saw that happen before. And I hear it all the time. And it's somewhat upsetting because very often you think that you bring on a guy that has, decades of experience, that he's seen almost anything. But what you often find out is not the case. Nobody has seen everything. Anything can happen. This is a very difficult business. There's a lot of risk. The earth is unpredictable, and a lot can happen, and nobody has seen everything. Every well is unique. So, you want to do the best job you can to arm your team with as much information as possible in order to be able to troubleshoot some of these situations, and encourage them when there is a problem to reach out, to management and so on. And it's not micromanaging. It's like, hey, we don't want to have a problem. So if you see something, anything, call, like phone somebody, get on the phone. Let's talk it through. Let's find an expert. It's like, people, when I was operating, people are calling me 24 hours a day. And, it's just part of it. And I'm always grateful that they never hesitated. And I told them, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me, and then when they are calling at all the hours, then you have a good culture, because nobody's hesitating to reach out to you, right? And nobody's too proud to say, like, hey, I don't know what's going on out here. I have this problem. This is what I'm seeing. So that's what you want to hear. If you don't have that, if I have had situations where the environment wasn't friendly, and people that I've worked for and so on, and they weren't. That wasn't. Nobody wanted to do it because nobody wanted to wake this person up or call that person. And then those are situations where you become concerned because what's going on in the field. Like nobody wants to say anything.